Good afternoon. My name is Mark Little. I'm the Executive Director of the Create Center at UNC Chapel Hill and co-chair of Black Communities, a conference for collaboration. My conference co-chair, Carla Slocum, is unable to join us today. She'll be back for next Friday's webinar. But in addition to being conference co-chair, she's also director of the UNC Institute for African American Research and professor in the UNC Department of Anthropology. So I just want to briefly welcome you to the 5th session in our webinar series on Black communities and COVID-19. This has been an outgrowth of the conference. And today we'll talk with a panel of community and academic experts on the impact on business and economic development in the Black community. We're also really fortunate to have a guest moderator, so I will get to stop talking in just a second here. But let me just introduce Napoleon Wallace, and then I'll hand it over to him. Napoleon is co-founder of Activest, which is a social justice research and advisory firm, and Partners in Equity North Carolina, an investment fund focused on supporting owner-occupied commercial real estate for minority and women-owned businesses. In addition, Napoleon is a senior fellow at Frontline Solutions, a Black-owned management consultancy working with the nation's largest nonprofits and philanthropies. He has more than 15 years of experience in finance and community economic development, and has led and supported numerous successful impact efforts with private, public, and nonprofit sectors. Most recently, Napoleon served as the Deputy Secretary of the North Carolina Department of Commerce. And so with that, before I hand it over, just want to let everyone know, all of the attendees, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to pose questions and comments, and we'll bring those in as the discussion moves forward. All right, Napoleon.
Thanks, Mark. I really do appreciate it. And I'd say to all the panelists, we're really excited to be able to, all the attendees, we're really excited to be able to chat with you all today. I think we all know that the issue of COVID-19 has truly been a devastating event, but it has had really outsized impacts on communities of color. And I think that, whether we look at it from a health perspective or whether we look at it from a workforce perspective, there are going to be long-lasting outcomes, but really try to think about it from an economic perspective and the impact on communities of color. We think, especially Black communities, we think is really relevant conversation for the time. So with that, I would like to give an introduction of the panelists today, have a little bit of time for folks to be able to, kind of describe some of their work, and more importantly, how it relates to this issue of Black economic development in the wake of COVID-19. But I know that we have a few folks on the line today that are North Carolina natives, North Carolina adjacent. I am also one of these people, and I just want to take a quick moment to give recognition of a loss that the state of North Carolina has recently experienced. The pioneer and really social justice, one of the greatest social justice minds of our time, Andrea Harris, passed earlier this week. She was the president and founder of the Institute for Minority Economic Development, which prioritized issues around the board, across the board, but especially on issues of minority economic development, supply diversity, HBCU role in economic development, among a number of other issues. And for folks on the line, if you just Google Andrea Harris, you'll see that there's some real substantial impact that she had in her life, that she leaves in her legacy. She had a direct impact on me. Was enough of an impact that the whole state of North Carolina government flew at half-mast yesterday. So I'd like to just take a quick moment, a few seconds, to start with a moment of silence to really show our appreciation and recognition of a great leader. Thank you for that. So big takeaway. We all have great leaders in our communities. We want to make sure that we show them love, appreciate them, and utilize their intelligence and brilliance and genius for all that we can. And I think today is really emblematic of that, the call that we're going to have, because we have a few really great leaders on the line today. Really excited to be able to talk a little bit about that and be able to introduce folks. So as you heard, my name is Napoleon Wallace. I'm with ActiveS. We do municipal bond research in impact investing, municipal bond research. Think investing in Ferguson before all the stuff happened and trying to get them to change their social policies. In addition, Pi and C, Partners in Equity, we focus on a form of down payment assistance for owner-occupied commercial real estate. So with that, as we said earlier, we have some really great panelists. I'd like to start off with the introduction of Vanessa Perry. Vanessa is Assistant Dean for Faculty and the Professor of Marketing at George Washington University School of Business in DC, where she has a focus on consumer credit, consumer finance, as well as consumer behavior and decision making. I think that's going to be really relevant for the conversation we're having today. We also have Elijah Davis. Elijah is a strategic growth manager of the Urban Impact Birmingham and Birmingham, Alabama, where he coordinates the administration of new programs that support small business retention, expansion, attraction, and also policy development. Thank you, Elijah, for being here today. And then last but not least, we have Nikitra Bailey. Nikitra is the Executive Vice President at the Center for Responsible Lending in Durham, North Carolina. She oversees all the coordination of constituents, as well as coalition building, as well as policy development. Really thankful to have folks on the line today, and really appreciative for them dedicating and contributing a bit of their time. So we have a relatively packed morning. We'll go ahead and dive right in, and we'll start with a really kind of high level question. For each panelist, maybe take a couple of minutes. First off, please talk a little bit more about your work and how you see it connecting to the issue of Black economics, Black economies more broadly. And please do tell a little bit about your work and your organization as well. We'll go ahead and get started. Vanessa, would you mind leading us off?
Absolutely. Happy to be here. Really, really ecstatic to be here. So my work my work really deals with understanding the impact of marketplace dynamics on consumers, particularly in terms of housing and financial markets. So I've been doing research in these areas for the past 20 years. Recent work has looked at the effects of gentrification on consumers and long-term residents in gentrified neighborhoods, on their access to goods and services. I've been looking at racial dynamics in the context of artificial intelligence of late. And I have been looking at the effects of cumulative disadvantage on mortgage credit and access to housing opportunities. Or more broadly speaking, all of these things relate to Black economies and sort of economic position of Black communities. And so I am very passionate about studying the race and racism in the marketplace.
Thank you for that, Vanessa. I know that connects very closely to some of the work that happens over at the Center for Responsible Lending, deal with all issues from payday to mortgage fraud, mortgage crisis, predatory lending. Nikitra, would you mind following up with a little bit of detail about your work and how it connects to Black communities?
Absolutely. So at CRO, we're a research and policy advocacy organization. We're affiliated with Self-Help, which is one of the nation's largest community development financial institutions that has for more than 40 years actually provided access to safe and responsible loans in our communities, because our communities have a history of being underserved by mainstream banking institutions. And then our work at CRO is really centered on creating greater economic equity in our communities, specifically fighting for the elimination of those abusive practices that drain our communities hard fought and long-term wealth, and really trying to set the ground for some structural reforms that will allow us to proceed on a more economic and level playing field as the marketplace continues.
Thank you, Nikitra. So at this point, as you all can see, we definitely have, the academic side, really trying to understand the empirical analysis behind a lot of what's happening in our communities. And then we have the policy side, really trying to change for reform. Elijah, a lot of the work that you do is straight up economic development. How are you growing communities? How are you getting investment? How are you growing jobs and businesses? Can you talk a little bit about the work of the urban impact and how you see that work connecting to communities of color?
Thank you so much, Napoleon, and thank you all so much. I'm ecstatic to be here. I have the privilege of serving one of the most historic and influential Black communities in the nation, situated in the historic 4th Avenue Business and Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument District. This is the landscape by which Project C, Martin Luther King, Reverend Shuttlesworth, Diane Nash, James Bevel, all coordinated the Children's March that led toward the momentum, and it was also a place of one of the most horrific sites of domestic terrorism. But there's a 70-year history that encapsulates our community, and that history is such that the first Black architect in the nation, Robert Robinson Taylor, designed the Masonic Temple. The second Black architect, Wallace Rayfield, designed 16th Street Baptist Church. And we have currently today 55 Black businesses and an 18 square block footprint in downtown, mostly. And we have 25 of those being women-owned Black businesses today, with a land ownership rate in the historic corridor of about 80%. We were founded as a community economic development agency by the first Black mayor of Birmingham, Dr. Richard Arrington, and has since migrated to be an independent community economic development agency, really focused on impacting the people, place, and business, and preserving the legacy and continuing the legacy of the district. And so particularly, we are, as the national monument came in the Obama administration's sort of midnight hours. He left in January of 2017. Our national monument was January 12th. And so, that really began to spur a discussion of what does it mean to have a cultural innovation district? How do we plan that? And so our organization deals with urban planning, business technical assistance, and other sort of capital. Some of our chief programs were in an urban Maine community, associated with the National Main Street Center. We're a Kiva trustee, and we're a part of the Start Spark Network, a network of 20 plus communities doing entrepreneurship education in communities of color. So that's, and some of those folks would be like Mortar and Launch Chattanooga and folks like that. So, the work that we do is literally the practitioner standpoint, day to day in barbershops, in, retail stores, taking the calls, and also advocating and being intermediaries with governmental organizations and the public. So we're on the ground, but we love the opportunity to be connected with the academic institution as well as everything. So really excited for our work.
So as everyone can see, Elijah, really thank you for that. As everyone can see, we really do have kind of all facets of all perspectives on the issues of Black economies, especially like COVID-19. We have practitioner perspective, policy perspective, and academic. And so just want to take a little bit of a step back, frame up a few things with information that we know. One, we know that there's a major health crisis around COVID-19, obviously, but the economic crisis, which is gonna come, we've heard lots of thinking ideas about it. One, that it could be potentially one of the greatest wealth transfers even greater than the Great Recession. And part of that is not just because of the physical assets that have possibility of transfer, but ability to work, lack of education, sort of equitable access that could come out of this, as well as some of the workforce and earning potential, which means that we're looking at a situation where, earning potential for large swaths of a generation could be affected. In addition to that, we know that there are fiscal impacts at the local level. All the states are kind of raising their hands right now, asking for, support from the federal government. At this point, we have not seen that level of support come. As we know from the recently, kind of released municipal lending facility, the first tranche of that really didn't allow for any of the largest Black communities in the nation to participate in the municipal lending facility. They've since expanded the parameters, but you're still leaving out quite a large number of Black communities. So there is an impact that even the fiscal entities at the local municipal level that really are delivering services to underinvested communities might be impacted in a way that makes it so that Black communities have less access. And then I'd say the last time, it seems like every time there's a crisis, there is a massive sort of consumer credit, mortgage credit, small business credit impact that has a long tail effect on communities of color, especially Black communities. And doesn't seem like we're doing anything to make this one any different, but also want to tee up for opportunities to improve. So that being said, I'd like to ask a question. I'll put it out as a jump ball to everyone. What do you, in your line of work, find to be kind of the most concerning in terms of the state of Black communities and the potential economic impact on Black communities as a result of COVID-19? Don't worry, for folks in the audience, we're going to get to the good stuff, but we'll just start out with trying to define the reality that we're in. Anyone take a shot?
So this is Nikitra Napoleon. I was trying to keep it together as you introduced and had us honor Ms. Harris today. Ms. Harris for us was more than just a leader. She was our sister girl and she was our friend. And in so many ways, she was our teacher. And some of the things that she taught us is that we've got to be prepared and ready to go in a crisis. And unfortunately, at this moment, we know that this crisis is going to come and fall disproportionately on our community as we've been hardest hit by economic calamity before. So we're having a profound public health crisis and an equally profound financial crisis. When you look at the services and the sectors that have been most impacted by COVID thus far, those are the services and the places where we tend to be highly employed. When we think about the impact on small businesses, our small businesses operate in those sectors. So we are in a really precarious financial position, and not only because of what's going on right now with COVID, but because of the historic and the structural inequities that continue to manifest themselves in our communities, that we are in the position that we have less economic stability when a national and global pandemic like COVID comes along. So quite frankly, I'm going to be really clear here. Things are bleak, and there's no way to think about it other than that. We are dying disproportionately related to this. When you look at the COVID-related deaths, we are dying at 2.5 times greater than everyone else, which is disproportionate to our representation in the nation. When you go to certain parts of the country, some states, that times is up to 7 times greater than our population in those states. And then when you look at Black unemployment, the unemployment figures just came out. When you look at those unemployment figures, we are at 16.7% unemployment. And that's not counting the people who've already dropped outside of the economic space right now. So I don't want us to at all underestimate the gross economic forecast that our community is going to deal with COVID, but I also want us to be really firm and being really clear that we're going to fight for equitable distribution of these dollars because we are taxpayers and we have to fight to get our fair share. And I'm going to talk about some of those additional things on how we can achieve more equity with these relief dollars and other remarks.
Thank you so much, Nikita. Really appreciate that. Other panelists would like to lean into this first question.
This is Vanessa Perry. Again, thank you, Nikita. I can't improve upon those statements, so I'm just going to restate basically what you said in my own words, that that this crisis has amplified barriers that have already been in place for a long time that relate to economic opportunity for those of us in Black communities. We can see the effects of segregation. If you look at the maps of the patterns of infection, it is very clear where Black populations are concentrated in the relationship there. We know that this segregation is a result of past public policy failures, of discrimination and other manifestations of cumulative disadvantage. And we know that some of the solutions that have been put in place, at least at the federal government level, have not really trickled down to us. You know, I'll provide one example. This Paycheck Protection Program, these loans that were supposed to be available for small businesses, the launch of this program has been largely a fiasco. Many of the lending institutions that participate actually require that small businesses have not just a depository relationship, but also a pre-existing credit relationship with the institution, and prohibit a relationship with any other financial institution in order to qualify for those loans. Well, that's just one example that we know is going to have a negative and disparate impact on small businesses in the Black community. That is just, indefensible as a restriction. And again, that's just one example. Lenders are doing the same kinds of things for mortgage lending. People who want to refinance because they want to take advantage of the low interest rates, or they want to try to lower their payments because of the crisis, and they may be facing, lower incomes or unemployment. These banks are imposing similar kinds of really, really strict restrictions on lending. And so we know what's going to happen, as Nikita so eloquently said. This is grave, and it's going to be even worse for us, as crises always are.
And Vanessa, to that end, I know that a lot of folks looked at PPP as almost an example at the local level of this is how you get money out. And so I agree with you, when you put out the idea that, one, there's a 5% fee that every lending institution earns, up to, depending on the size of the loan. Think back in the envelope, we saw the first round was going to have about $12.5 billion go to, at the time, majority large banks. And then the other item being, so you had a lot of earned revenue, but then also you had a lot of folks trying to shore up their portfolios. So again, to your point, how do you make it so that your current portfolios perform well? Which means you want to get them maybe the money first into that lending relationship. But then when you back up and you say, well, how many Black businesses have relationships with a large PPP lender existing? We know that we're kind of like, less likely to have that. And how many are also in a position where, we have an outsized number that are sole proprietorships, and those also came on later. So it does seem like there's some real opportunities to improve the way that policy interventions happen. and the way that they are impacting communities. Uh, Elijah, I know that you're dealing with a lot of this local level in Birmingham. I believe I saw you all have a rescue fund up and running throughout Birmingham. And I know there have been some thoughts, or not controversy, but thinking around that. I'd love to get your perspective on this first question of where are some of the biggest, maybe most dire sort of situations as you look at this COVID-19?
Yeah, no, I agree with both of my co-panelists in their comments. I would, especially in the overexposure of service industries and also the gap in terms of funding. So the thing that to me has been the most alarming, and I say alarming because it's always been alarming, it's just been the comprehensive lack of understanding around micro enterprises, just first, and their nature, their characteristic, their needs, and then Black businesses, right? So there is a capital gap, just like you have a health insurance gap, there's a literal gap. And so when people are talking about, number one, the SBA is gonna, roll out products in 2 weeks, right? As someone who used to package SBA loans in a previous life, I'm like, okay. And then also understanding, I'm one of those people that look at SBA statistics monthly and see that 3% for Black folks. Even in Region 4 in SBA, where we are in the South, where we have the most Black-owned businesses. And so you just begin to understand, to also the point you mentioned around the lack of traditional depository relationships, and also the key gap of those relationships, because in order to get access to a business banker, right, you need to be making revenues that are outside of the characteristic of most micro enterprises. Most micro enterprises and small businesses are anywhere from 50 to 250,000 a year. And when you think about business bankers at banks only, having to have accounts and folks that make $1 million and up, that's an automatic gap. So I would summarize and say that the greatest alarm has been always the broken ecosystem to truly support micro enterprises and Black businesses. And that has cascading effects all the way around. The Birmingham Business Alliance did a survey, which is our chamber here, regional chamber. And it basically told us numerically what we understood, which was that, out of, the minority-owned businesses, which made up 42% of the responses, half of those respondents said that they've experienced revenue losses of 75% or more. And then we also understand the cash on hand, most folks not having more than 30 days. And so my immediate concern was not only the lack of guidance from a federal level on financial products and rule changing, which is natural in a sort of rule commenting way, but it was also the alarm around the lack of clear structured guidance and cooperation on a federal and a state level around, because that type of uncertainty dissuades a community, consumer confidence, and understanding that most of our businesses are B2C anyway. Consumer confidence is a key part of that business model. And then also thinking about from just planning and adaptation. And so all of the well-noted things that we understand from any report that anyone has read, particularly AEO's Tapestry report and everything that's come before that, has just been magnified. I will say I do commend the response by the city to begin to address the gap, because in the state of Alabama, as you know, in order to access the economic injury disaster loan, you have to actually have a declared disaster. And that seemed to be something that was delayed. And so the argument was to help have an intervening financial product. And please do not take this as any critique, but there's still a gap, because there's a vast majority of micro enterprises who do not have debt as a business model. Right, when you think about, according to Kaufman Foundation, that like 80% of just business owners, period, bootstrap it. And then you think about one of the reasons why we have the lack of access to capital is that we just have lack of access to wealth, right? So you're asking folks who have done it themselves to now in an uncertain environment acquire, debt and then change rules on forgivability. And so that is the reason why I am glad that, folks like LISC, we actually had someone in the district get the LISC Verizon grant, which is fantastic. So I think what we hope goes forward from this, as someone phrased it, I wish I could cite exactly who it was, but they said the next normal. Mm-hmm. Because we have to fundamentally restructure the ways in which we support Main Street businesses, the mm-hmm. ways in which we support businesses in communities of color.
Thanks for that, Elijah. And I really like that framing. I think that there have been two things. One, there's always been a question of Main Street versus our street. Right, like there's just kind of a difference in the way that we're financed, that we operate, a number of things. But then also, I think, kind of to your point, there are entities that are really working alongside a lot of our communities and our streets. And so you mentioned LISC, Nikidra mentioned self-help. In the second round of PPP money, there was some dedicated capital that really went into the CDFI world and the minority depositories, because they're the ones that really have those relationships, on our street, if you will, and really trying to see how you can get those dollars out. And so with that said, we've ended the most depressing part of our conversation. Now, we'd really like to start thinking about, some of the solutions. So if we're framing it up again, this is going to be, and we know this crisis is going to be a crisis of health. It's going to be a crisis of education, workforce, earning potential. And I'll just toss out some of the big ideas that I've heard. I've heard folks say there's over $2 trillion that has now been injected into the U.S. economy. Student loan debt is a little bit over $2 trillion. Wipe out student loan debt. If you want to get it, snap back, right? Which in many cases will have an outsized impact on Black communities. Also heard, folks say, well, look, if you're thinking about ownership, we know that property values are coming down in areas where we actually have a lot of Black real estate or Black businesses. There's opportunity for ownership. 5 banks are willing to take less in the form of down payment, so that Black businesses that maybe have not historically had a significant amount of wealth will have the opportunity to buy their buildings and contribute to their communities. And there are a number of other things, ranging from community college interventions to consumer credit interventions. And so to you all, I toss out, another question. What do you see as some of the biggest opportunities in terms of Black economic development, whether it's policy, workforce, wealth creation, rebuilding and affirming community institutions, or just rebuilding the social fabric? But we've heard a lot about mutual aid these days, whether it be Black churches, whether it be other insured community institutions that are showing up for their community in a different way. So want to toss it out to folks. Maybe if you give an idea of what you think some of the biggest opportunities are, as well as what you think some of the best strategies for accomplishing those might be. I'll give it out as a jump ball, so anyone that wants to kind of lean into that would love to hear it.
This is an opportunity to really renegotiate how we've done things. When we talk about economic impact, McKinsey & Company's research has shown us that discrimination against Black America doesn't only cost Black America, it actually costs the overall economy. They did a report last year that show that it's costing us about $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion to have this discrimination go unchecked, and that in fact our GDP could increase by 4 to 6% if we stop this discrimination. So this isn't only about our communities, this is about the economy overall. And then when you talk about PPP lending and the opportunities that it provides, we have to remember that small businesses of color are major economic engines in our local economies, our regional economies. So we're talking about whole parts of the country that are impacted if our businesses don't have access. They are already generating about $1.3 trillion to the economy, and they're employing more than 8.5 million people. So these are significant contributions that we have to make sure are sustained. So we need to fix the PPP program and make sure that the institutions that really well have strong track records of serving small businesses of color have access to those dollars. So what we've called for is a straight up set aside for community development financial institutions and minority depository institutions. They've done it better than everybody else thus far, and they need the resources to really work with small businesses of color to make sure that those businesses can get access to the resources that they need. We also need to extend some of the deadlines related to how those loans need to be repaid and what amount of time can be counted for those loans. It's been said, most of our businesses are single employee owned firms. So they are going to have smaller resources to count for their payroll and their expenses. So you have to extend the time so that you can actually help them during this time stay afloat, because we cannot afford to lose the infrastructure that they've created. We also got to talk about a fairer homeownership during this time. We know that so much wealth in this country has been the result of our nation's investment in homeownership. That investment prior to now has really significantly been in the white community. We've used taxpayer dollars to ensure that white communities could get access to low down payment mortgages. We've got to do the same thing in a more equitable way for communities of color. And we've got to talk about the subprime crisis. We can't just go from, the previous redlining moment and skip over subprime. In fact, subprime disproportionately impacted Black and Latino communities and cost us $1 trillion in wealth. And that wasn't for people who actually experienced foreclosure themselves, but people who happen to live in proximity to foreclosure. So we have to create structural reforms that allow for more fairness in our homeownership space. And some of the things that are on the kind of plate right now that could really help us with that is that there are significant dollars in the HEROES Act. That's the legislation that came out of the House Financial Services Committee and the House overall, that is going to be targeted at providing a moratorium for our community and all communities that are experiencing hardship related to COVID. There's $100 billion for renters. This is really important because there's a significant amount of people in our community who are renters right now. There's $100 billion of money for renters to make sure they can remain in place. There's also a $75 billion targeted for homeownership to really kind of operate in a way like the previous hardest hit fund money to ensure homeowners can sustain. There's also this forbearance that would extend the current levels of forbearance that have been offered up to an entire year for families to ensure that those who cannot afford to repay their mortgage because they're COVID impacted have an ability to do so. And then there are some provisions related to student loan that have to be strengthened. Our students disproportionately carry student loan debt. And what we need to make sure is that right now, as again, those sectors are hardest hit, that all those students have resources that they need right now to be able to cover the fact that they might be without work during this time. So we need to beef up the student loan provisions in the HEROES Act to make sure there's more support for people who are not experiencing delinquency, because right now the call is only for support for people experiencing delinquency. We know very well that getting into trouble and then getting out is really harder for us. So we've got to help people before they actually get into trouble.
Thank you, Nikisha. I mean, that approach sounds like it really does hit all of the areas, which is what we need, right? I mean, you don't just need housing and mortgage reform. You don't just need, more access to capital for small businesses prioritizing MDIs and CDFIs, but you really do need an across-the-board strategy. because the attacks on Black communities have been across the board. To the other panelists, want to ask the same question. What do you think is some of the biggest opportunities to really be able to come out of this, build on prior work, but also really trying to make sure that we're mitigating the impacts of COVID-19?
Well, this is Vanessa, and I'll just mention again, thank you again, Nikitra, for saying everything I was thinking. But we have an election coming up, and one of the things that I think we're going to need to do is to restore and expand some of the existing sort of policy, public policy kinds of protections that many of us have been working on for many years. There have been attacks and attempts to dismantle the Community Reinvestment Act, the Fair Housing Act, all kinds of criminal justice, education, environmental reforms, all of which affect our communities, have been affecting us. And we've already stated that they're going to, as a result of these issues, we're going to have even more problems coming out of this current public health crisis. And so we can't afford to let these protections continue to be eroded and unenforced. So we're going to have to take our opportunities to do that. I think on a sort of more uplifting kind of perspective that, one of the things that I'm hoping comes out of this is sort of an increased emphasis on social capital in our communities. Social capital gets sort of undervalued. It's the secret hidden resource that for some reason in the United States, people are uncomfortable talking about, maybe because we're so accustomed to it accruing to people who can inherit networks and contacts and access, and others get left out of it. But we all know that there are powerful and influential people within networks in Black communities. And so it's time for us to do a better job at connecting and leveraging those influential people. And I think about how I got here today via a network of scholars who are focused on, race in the marketplace, people research in that area. And I got connected with BlackCom, and here I am. And that's just sort of one example of how, there are things in place that we can use to sort of help each other and help others in Black communities. We just really need to go out of our way to do that. No one is going to necessarily just hand it over to us.
I mean, absolutely. It's hard to add for Dr. Perry and Ms. Bailey. I agree wholeheartedly. I think what we see an opportunity is that this is an inflection point for service providers. I am probably a cusper of millennial and post-millennial, and I am just, constantly, my peers and I are probably agitated that, we believe that workshops where people kill trees and put them in front of folks work, So I think that innovation and collaboration is now non-negotiable, right? And the sort of explicit support of Black business and minority and women-owned business and every particularly marginalized person who starts enterprise is now non-negotiable. Equity has to be at the center of every conversation, and equity on all types of fronts. I think that when you look at some of the responses, I do uplift, Birmingham's own response, because that's novel, particularly for the city of Birmingham to even respond, and also with workforce opportunities. But we also think about Portland's response, thinking about how they responded and literally even looking at where the grants and loans came from in the city and giving a report of that. We make sure that we, in a sense, decolonize and rethink the methods of which we believe technical assistance and capacity building should be administered. I have long been agitated by sort of the top-down approaches that, you know, many folks have taken in the past, instead of really understanding cultural context and really being innovative. If I were to give sort of an example, if you were in business and you had a product and your customer was not responding to the product, you'll be out of business if you didn't change the method. Well, you know, it is the state of many of our CDFI, service provider organizations, that we have stayed stagnant with 1990s techniques. It is now 2020. Right, and to Ms. Bailey's point about true investment in community-based organizations and CDFIs, you know, if we all are competing against funds with, you know, 2 and 3 person shops, there's nothing going to get done, right? And so collaboration and innovation are now non-negotiables in holistic support, because we know that not only did we see a rise of Black entrepreneurship over the past decade as a result of sort of the Great Recession, but we also saw specifically Black women being sort of the leaders in that group. But often Black women are locked out of capacity building programs because of just simple stuff like the lack of childcare, right? The lack of, you know, I mean, just all types of particular things. And so for folks to be designing programs and not think about some of these core things are no longer. The second thing is that from a business standpoint, I am excited that I think we have an incentive to rethink our business models, right? So I am in a district of legacy businesses, many of which I do not blame for the way they have been organized, operating, and making money, because that is the environment for which they have. However, I think what this does is create an incentive to potentially rethink business models. We've had more conversations about setting up LLCs and getting online that we have been able to jumpstart in 3 years. But I'm also really encouraged that the entire picture is not bleak. In Birmingham, we have this fantastic culture and rising culture of food trucks. And I love our folks, because our folks picked a empty strip mall and created a open, socially distant food court. You know, our folks began to do at home natural hair videos, you know, so we're Birmingham, we're Alabama. We've always been resilient. We've always sort of been in that way. And so I think that you know, and I uplift my colleague and her sort of very forward-thinking research, Ariel Smith with the Black Food Truck Scholar, who's also a friend of Black communities, and I think she'll be a panelist later, so I'll let her speak to the ways in which that we can be more creative in the ways that we support folks and the way that we support culture and identity. So I think that most people who had been turning a blind eye to the things that we've been preaching and studying about realize it's real. And I think that innovation and collaboration in our way, not in the way that is projected, will now be free.
And so, you know, we are getting close on time, and I'll hand it back to Mark, but just want to say, you know, one of the things I think has been really amazing as we've been going through this, it really does align with this idea of mutual aid, is that, yes, early in the process, everything was dire, everything was bleak. And I think you look across the board, we kind of knew what that looked like. But even in the past, you know, kind of this last round of PPP and other sort of legislation, feels like our voices are being heard. You know, the collective sort of grouping of folks saying, hey, we noticed that this wasn't happening, we need you to fix it, has really led, you know, quite a bit of opportunity and innovation. Things that I will point out, you know, we have the high level stuff, obviously. I think there's 100 billion still left in PPP. It's going out at a rate of about 500 million a day. So, you know, you're looking at maybe a couple of 100 days of capital still left there. And then you have folks like, you know, P. Diddy, Magic Johnson, all that showing up with, new initiatives, our fair share, or other lending initiatives to be able to try to get dollars out. Do think that that's really important. I also can't overstate the importance of the point that Keitra made, that really making sure that the folks that are doing the most lending already in communities of color are really well supported and positioned to be able to get dollars out the door. We know, and I'm an ex-self-helper, I was on that team for a little bit of time. We know that in our communities, the financials might look a little different, maybe, right? Like the TA and traditional sort of, accounting might be a little different, not that, but there might need to be a bit of additional TA, or that folks are just resistant to go to a lender because they've been denied so many times. So I really do think that there's an opportunity for focusing on communities that are prioritizing communities of color, focusing on businesses. We're getting capital in the communities of color is a part of their business model. And if we continue to do that, sounds like with as well some policy change, some on the ground interventions like we're seeing down in Birmingham, as well as a really thoughtful and clear-headed assessment on what's happening out there from an academic perspective, then we really do have an opportunity to move things forward. So I'll stop and leave with just one small quote, not a big deal, but again, a nod to Andrea Harris. My prior role was as Deputy Secretary of Commerce for the state of North Carolina. And one of the folks who really got me into that role not only told me that I should do it, but also was a voice and a reference since I got into that role was Andrea Harris. And I remember getting the gig, being appointed by the governor, one of the biggest roles I've ever had. And I called her and just wanted to thank her. And she said, Napoleon, don't thank me yet because we ain't done yet. And I feel like that sort of sentiment is really where we are today. There have been a lot of really great ideas tossed out, a lot of really great concepts. Want to open it up for questions. But the idea is that wherever we learn from here, we have to find a way to execute on it because we're not done yet. So thank you, Mark. I'll turn it back over to you to see if we have some questions.
But before we get to questions, can I add one point? We have to flood our members of Congress right now. We have to flood our state legislative leaders. We have to flood our local leaders. We have to demand our fair share. We can't wait for it. We have to let them know that we are American taxpayers and these resources have to come into our communities. When the money comes from the federal government, it is going to go into state and local budgets. We have to make sure that those investments show up in our communities. And the only way that's going to happen is if we, on a daily basis, send a note to our elected representatives and demand investment in our spaces.
Great. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you for that, Nikita.
We have a few questions and we don't have much time. So what I'd like to do is just ask a question. And if there's one person who wants to respond to it, and then we'll just slip to the next question and get another person to respond. So we had one person write in about something I was unaware of, that Zillow announced that it will be using COVID-19 data to highlight zip codes of the greatest real estate investment for homeowners that maintain good credit through this crisis. Just want to say, do any of the speakers think this could be a problem? I do, but any speakers think that they're concerned that Zillow maps of real estate opportunity overlaid with zip codes of COVID-19 disease areas could become a virtual red line? Just anyone want to speak on if they're aware of this, their response to it, or just hearing about it? Any comments?
I'm just about to text a friend who likes to, who's a attorney, a fair lending attorney, and she likes to form classes and sue institutions so that she can be ready to jump on that one, because it sounds like settlements out the wazoo.
So I was going to raise a similar point that we want to be careful during this time to make sure that companies are compliant with our nation's fair lending laws. They are still on the books and they are going to be pushed to be enforced. Our colleagues at the National Fair Housing Alliance are the leaders in this space. And I'm certain that if that is as described, that is something that they will pay a ton of attention to. And it's also why we as a community have to fight for the fair lending dollars that are in the HEROES Act, because we know that at moments like this is when these really shady things start developing, and we have to have a very fast response before any of those things occur, because we cannot afford to rebuild. We actually are already on a very unstable economic platform. We are in a more precarious position, so we can't take any risks.
Great. Another question, this is a big one, but I think it's probably going to be the last one that we'll have time for. How do you feel this moment has exposed the digital divide as it relates to business and economic development, and any solutions that you might throw out there around access, innovation, or infrastructure?
Well, I would say that, we've talked about the digital divide. I think it has become real to people now. And I would say that we have to embrace ways in which that we just do some old school community organizing to make sure that folks get what they need and we can get what we can get. And what do I mean by that? We have a few businesses who are offline, have been offline, but it's, when you're trying to, oh, I need to get this application. Well, who do you know that is online, right? You have a sister, brother, cousin, somebody. And so I think that's where the good old community organizing comes in. I think I want to uplift AEO, Association for Enterprise Opportunity, for working with GoDaddy for some of the digital seminar and trainings to do free sort of things of that nature. And the local CDFI here, True Fund, for which we partner with, we've had a cohort of people matriculate sort of through that digital marketing piece. But I think that we definitely need to think about, broadband equity and infrastructure equity in particular, because as we have the emergence of smart city and smart city technology, there are a whole just layer of ethical and real concerns that we need to be paying attention to. So I think there are ways to overcome it with good old community organizing, but I think that goes back to one of those non-negotiables of service providers. Everything that we do has to have that in the purview of our services to make sure that everyone has the best fighting chance to participate in the economy.
And the CARES Act provided resources, and that's why the HEROES Act is also really important, because there are resources to make sure, in the same way that we are trying to ensure people don't lose their homes, that there's utility support for families, and we're defining broadband in that legislation as important utility support, because for our community, so many Black folk are in rural communities. It's like a silent reality that people pretend that we all live in urban America. That is not the case. We populate many of the rural communities across the country. So for us, those provisions in the CARES Act that already passed, that already extends those dollars, and then the new money that's being offered up in HEROES is even more protected. And it's part of the reason why we really need everybody listening today. Pick up your phone, call your Senate offices, let them know we need the HEROES Act. And there'll be political ramifications for people who don't support this important legislation.
I would have to agree, the broadband issue, or just digital divide more broadly. I want to say the last stat I heard is nationwide access to broadband for communities of color or Black communities or Black households was just above 50%, whereas for Asian Americans it was around 80%, and for white Americans it was also around 80%. And so I do think that, we're talking about a world where density and is maybe a bit of an enemy, where proximity is going to lead people to work from home, is going to lead people to purchase from home, that our businesses, our communities, they aren't wired. It exposes us, not only to additional sort of risk in terms of proximity, COVID-19, but also less able to grab wallet share, because it doesn't matter if you have a digital storefront. If you don't have the back-end infrastructure or broadband to be able to take advantage of that, there really is nothing that you can do to compete. So know that we have to toss it back over to you, Mark, but I'd say that, personally, as a moderator, get to moderate a lot of these things. I really appreciate the panel we had today. Really appreciate the questions. Mark, thank you for allowing us to have this moment in front of the Black community's audience. And I really hope folks got something out that they'll be able to take back to their local economy and make sure that they're supporting their Black community as best as possible.
Thank you, Napoleon. I want to thank you, Nikitra, Vanessa, Elijah, for the discussion today. It's very important. We actually had a comment come in that this is part 1, so we might need a part 2. So we'll let you know if we need to call you back. Thank you to the participants who contributed questions and comments. Next week's webinar will be on Black communities and COVID-19, and we're looking across the diaspora. It'll take place at 12 p.m. Eastern on Friday, May 29th, and we'll have community leaders from Nigeria, Canada, and the Ivory Coast, Teo Owoyeyi, Alexa Potashnik, and Samuel Mate. If there are any topics that you think we should explore, please let us know. You can reach us by email at blackcommunities@unc.edu or on Twitter or Instagram, and we're at Black Communities, and that's BLK Communities. And we're also on Facebook. So yeah, again, thanks to the panel. This was very helpful, inspiring, and I really appreciated the pivot, Napoleon, from kind of taking us from the doom and gloom to really thinking about what we can do to use this crisis to move forward. And I guess the last comment, I'll say 2 last comments. One, Andrea Harris was one of the first people that I met when I started doing work in community and economic development. And I kept quiet here, but this is the work that's close to what I do. And Thomas Stith, who is actually on the listening to this webinar, introduced me to her. And then secondly, this idea, I think there's what we've seen is people outside of the Black community are seeing or have the opportunity, we can't tell what people actually are seeing, but have the opportunity to see the gaps and issues that have been systematic for hundreds of years in how Black communities have been trying to deal with the economy of the United States. And so I think there is an opportunity right now to try to leverage that. Nikitra, you talked a little bit about the wealth that's being lost overall in the way that the United States has essentially dealt with Black communities. And so I'm hopeful for now, and let's keep it moving forward. Hope to see everyone next Friday at noon for the next phase of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.